So welcome everybody. For the next half an hour, we will take your questions on the restriction proposal concerning microplastics in products. My name is Hanna Torkkinen. I'm one of the press officers here in ECHA and your host for today. I'm joined in this virtual universe by four of my colleagues. So Tim Baumer, the chair of the Committee for Risk Assessment, Maria Ottati, the chair of the Committee for Socio-Economic Analysis, Peter Simpson, all the way from the UK, senior scientific officer leading the work on this proposal, and Director Peter van der Zandt. I'll give the floor now to Peter.
Thank you, Hanna-Kaisa, and good afternoon, everyone. ECHA's scientific committees have now concluded their opinions on the proposal to restrict the use of microplastics in the EU. This proposal was developed on request of the European Commission as part of the EU's plastic strategy, and it will be the world's most comprehensive restriction of microplastics in products. Why is the EU doing this, and what is the concern? Microplastics are persistent and universal pollutants. Once they are released to the environment, they stay there for centuries because they do not biodegrade. They have been found in our environment in water, seas and oceans, and in the soil as well as in food and in drinking water. Each year, around 42,000 tons of microplastics end up in our environment from the use of products containing them. And this is more than 6 times the quantity of microplastics in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is a result of more than 70 years of plastic littering. The biggest source of pollution is the microplastic infill material that is used on artificial turf pitches. The releases of microplastics are significant, particularly when considering their persistence, and they contribute to a permanent and growing environmental stock of microplastics that leads to irreversible pollution of our ecosystems and food chains. So what are ECHA's recommendations for the restriction? ECHA is recommending the Commission to ban products that contain microplastics from the EU market if these microplastics are inevitably released to the environment when the products are used. The recommendation is also to require companies to give instructions on how users of products can prevent or minimize any residual releases of microplastics to the environment. Companies then also need to report these microplastic uses and releases to ECHA to ensure that residual releases are monitored and, if necessary, controlled in the future. Derogations are recommended for some sectors, and some of these derogations are time limited. The time limits are set in a way that minimizes the negative impact to society, but does not unnecessarily delay the reduction of the emissions. Transition periods are proposed to give companies time to develop biodegradable alternatives to microplastics that maintain their useful properties, but without contributing to the microplastics concern. The proposed restriction will prevent the release of 500,000 tons of microplastics to the environment over 20 years following its introduction. ECHA has assessed the impacts of the proposed restriction on the key affected sectors. The total cost of the restriction to European society are estimated to be 11 or 90 billion euro, depending on how environmental risks from the granular infill material used on artificial turf pitches are addressed. The costs consist mainly of reformulation, raw material, and enforcement and compliance costs. So, the ECHA expert committees for risk assessment, the RAC, and for socio-economic analysis, the SEAC, have evaluated the strengths and weaknesses of the restrictions proposal, and they have concluded that they support an EU-wide restriction. The Committee for Risk Assessment looked at the risks of microplastics, principally to the environment, and the effectiveness of the proposal to address these risks, as well as the practicality of the proposal. and the RUC has concluded that the proposed restriction is the most appropriate means to address the identified risks. The Committee for Socioeconomic Analysis evaluated the costs and benefits of the proposal to the environment and society as a whole, and any other associated socioeconomic impacts. The SEAC concluded that the restriction is likely to be effective, also in terms of its benefits to human health and the environment, and its cost to companies, consumers, and society as a whole. The committees have now concluded their scientific and technical assessment, and they support the recommendation that an EU-wide restriction is the most appropriate means to address the risks of microplastics in products. This has been an extensive and transparent process, including collecting information to build a proposal, consulting our stakeholders on 2 occasions, and then for our expert committees to independently evaluate a proposal in their scientific capacity. ECHA's proposal and the scientific committee's opinion will be considered by the European Commission when they make their legislative proposal for the EU member states. The final decision on the restriction and its conditions is made by the Commission with the 27 EU member states and with scrutiny in the European Parliament and the Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. So now we're ready to take your questions. I will stop presenting so I can see all the hands. Okay, please, Robert, you go first.
Okay. Just checking you can hear me.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay.
Hello.
Right. Hello. Hi. I'm in my kitchen. So I've got a question about the definition of a microplastic. So the original proposal defined microplastics as ranging from 1 nanometer to 5 millimeters, and for fibers 3 nanometers to 15. And this was modified, raising the lower threshold for a microplastic to 100 nanometers. I see in the Q&A that this is justified on the basis that the ECHA recognized it would not be possible, at least in the short term, to detect particles smaller than 100 nanometers in final products. So my question is the fact that it's difficult to detect something a good enough reason not to ban it? You know, for example, you could still ban it if you know that it's harmful and take it on trust that companies aren't going to be illegally adding them to products. Just because it's difficult to enforce seems a strange reason not to introduce a law. The other question is there a danger that companies who are currently using, for example, microparticles of 110 nanometers might not just switch to 90 nanometer particles now, which are not controlled by the law? And a final question, if I may, technical one, just is it the average size of particles that we're talking about? Because I assume when you add them to a product, they're not all uniform in size. That's everything. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Robert. Let's start with the dossier submitters, so ECHA, Peter Simpson, and then go to the committees.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. Yeah, I can start. This is a good question. I'm not surprised this was the first one that came. I think ECHA have been clear that these nanoplastics, so these particles between 100 nanometers, 1 and 100 nanometers, shouldn't be added to products in order to circumvent any particular restriction. This would definitely be a regrettable substitution. And I think the RAC and the SEAC, in their opinions, all agree that nanoplastics shouldn't be added to products. The issue that you raise, of course, is that it is technically challenging to detect nanoplastics in mixtures in final products. You can detect them in other parts of the supply chain. And what it is that ECHA, as the dossier submitter, and the committees have had different ideas about how to sort of square the circle on this particular issue. As dossier submitter, we felt perhaps the safest and maybe the legally most certain option would be to change the conditions of the restriction, so not the definition of a microplastic, to have an upper limit, a lower limit of 100 nanometers. But there are some disadvantages associated with that, for example, so the labelling and reporting wouldn't apply to these smaller particles. we felt that it was important that the enforceability and the practicality was taken into account. And in fact, in Annex 15 of REACH, one of the criteria for actually implementing a restriction is that it is enforceable and practical. So we had to take that very seriously. But the RAC and the SEC had different views on how to address this particular issue, and this is where the opinions differ. Maybe I'll hand over to my colleagues who can explain what the RAC and SEC felt on these issues.
Hi, Tim Bomer here. Thanks for the question, Robert. I think it's a good one. Looking at the risks from the Committee of Risk Assessment perspective, we considered that there would be risks below the 100 nanometer, let's say, practical borderline. So we recommended, from our point of view, no lower limit to include everything. And that really comes out at accepting the dossier's submitter's initial proposal of 1 nanometer in practical terms. But we felt that measurability could change with time, and we wanted to be sure that from a risk perspective, everything was covered. But that's not to rule out that you may need practical ways of dealing with things in the meantime. So with that, I'll close my mic because my line's a bit unstable and hand over to Maria.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Tim, and thank you for the question. Indeed, it's a topic that's a little bit complex in that there are many different elements from the two committees. So the main thing to say is that SEAC recommended that the restriction should apply to all plastics particles that are larger than 1 nanometer. The 100 nanometer is a temporary lower size limit that is being recommended. For the reasons that Pete alluded to, that we would like it to be enforceable. And this is, we feel, necessary to ensure that the analytical methods available are appropriate to what can be enforced. However, we do note that the recommendation is that this temporary lower size limit of 100 nanometers is only in the cases that the restriction cannot be enforced by other means, for instance, through document checks. So that's I think that gives you the full picture with all the different elements.
And maybe I could come back just to Robert's other question, Maria, which was about if it was an average size, what it is. It's a particle size distribution that is actually part of the microplastics definition. So there needs to be 1% by weight of particles within the relevant range for the material to be considered as a microplastic.
Indeed, and Robert also had a question about potential, what we call regrettable substitution, that people would move from right over the limit to right under the temporary lower limit. And that is something that SEAC has considered, and that is mentioned in the opinion as a possibility that needs to be borne in mind. We received some information throughout the process about some potential technical difficulties in doing so, but of course other respondents felt that this was a very real possibility. So where the committee ended up is that we do not have the information to judge how likely this is, but to highlight it as a possibility indeed.
Maybe just to add finally on this issue, this regrettable substitution, I think theoretically it's very possible. I think the information that we had as dossier submitter is that there are very few of these uses of microplastics in this range. So that's why we were reasonably comfortable when we proposed this 100 nanometers limit, that we weren't compromising the effectiveness overall of the restriction. I think it's clear that the vast majority of microplastic uses here would fall within any of these ranges proposed here, and the 100 nanometer lower limit range would be no exception here.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot, Pete, Tim, and Maria. If I can summarize just simply, I took it from you that ECHA and the committees, they agree that nanoplastics should not be added to products. This 100 nanometer limit is just a consideration for the enforcement aspect. Okay, then let's go to Shahrazad. I apologize for my pronunciation. Could you also say your media? I forgot to mention this, so before you speak, if you could introduce your media as well.
Sure. Hi. Yes. Sorry, I don't have a camera. This is Shahrazad Puriyahi from European Rubber Journal, and I have two questions. One, a fairly quick one, and the other one is more about the rubber infills. One is, when do you think the European Commission will make its final decision on this issue? And the second one is that, as I can see, there's been a bit of a change of heart in terms of recommending a total ban on rubber infills. I've been told that it has something to do with a recent guidance published by the European Standards Committee on infill containment. So I wanted to maybe elaborate on that and explain the risk measurements, the risk measures that you're proposing.
Okay, who wants to go first?
Yeah, maybe just to the question of the European Commission's restrictions proposal. Of course, we are here in an ECHA Q&A, so I do not talk for the Commission. What I can basically say is that we have now concluded the opinions from the scientific committees. In the coming time, we will be finalizing, putting it together with let's say our recommendations to the Commission, so putting the proposal and the opinions together in an accompanying letter to the Commission. That will happen in the coming period. So in the first quarter, the Commission will receive our input. And then, of course, it is for the Commission to consider this input and to see how they want to draft any restrictions proposal for the inclusion into the REACH Annex. I cannot say anything at this point in time for the Commission timeline that they would use for preparing such a restriction.
And then maybe I could start on the second question. So in terms of the infill material and whether or not there's been a change of heart, I think that would be a misinterpretation actually of what the analysis and the opinions from the committees have said. From the dossier submitter perspective, we have assessed a range of options for addressing releases of microplastic infill from synthetic pitches, and as dossier submitter, we didn't ever prefer one of the options over the other. One of the options that was considered was a ban on the placing on the market of infill material with a transitional period of 6 years. And the other option that was assessed was this mandatory use of risk management measures with a transitional period of 3 years. And over the 20-year period, we assessed the effectiveness of those measures was assumed to be the same, because the shorter transitional period compensated for the residual releases that would occur with risk management measures. Now, all of these options were then assessed by the committees, and I think this is again that different committees have different views on the options that have been put forward and the ultimate advice that they wanted to give to the decision maker on the best way forward on the infill. So again, I'll pass on to Tim and Maria now to evaluate, to elaborate what the committee said.
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, we were confronted by the dossier submitter with two main choices, really. One was a ban, as Pete said, with a derogation for 6 years, which we felt was quite long in actual fact. But we really discussed long and hard about the other alternatives involving risk management measures. In the end, we felt that the effectiveness of the risk management measures was not strong enough. There wasn't sufficient guarantee that they would really work to prevent movement of microplastics off pitches by wear and tear and regular use, by refilling, etc., to the kind of levels that the modeling was telling us. So we really felt, after a long discussion and having considered all the information available to us, that a ban was the best way of reducing the risks from microplastics escaping from infill material on pitches as quickly as possible. And I think the members felt that the transition time was probably appropriate as well to achieve that. So over to you, Maria.
Yeah, so SEAC then evaluated the two options, same ones as RAC evaluated, but well, as well, there was a third hybrid option that was suggested by RAC, which was basically that existing pitches needed to install risk management measures, but then the use of microplastic infill would be banned on any new and refurbished pitches after a transitional period. So we considered all of those, and we did quite a lot of analysis on the potential impacts, but in the end, the committee did not prefer one over the other. It considered that all of them could be proportionate depending on what the policymakers' policy preferences would be. So basically in terms of the value it placed on quick emissions reduction. So that's where we are. And you mentioned this SEN report, I think, and that is something that was published very recently. It has been reflected, at least, mentioned in the SEAC opinion, but of course the information that it provides in terms of the effectiveness of risk management measures is not something that can be evaluated by SEAC. So that's not endorsed, but it is mentioned as something that could support the information about one of the potential restriction options.
Thank you, everybody. Does this answer your questions?
To a large extent, yes. Thank you.
Good. Okay, we don't have any hands up at the moment, so please ask questions now that you have all the experts here. In the meantime, I have a question myself, because I wanted to kind of reflect on there are also other microplastics, and we talk about here restricting microplastics that are added to products. So how does this kind of releases relate to the other microplastics?
Thanks, Hannah. Yes, another good question, of course, as well, and we quite often get this question about the relationship between the magnitude of releases that we've predicted for these intentionally added microplastics versus the volumes of plastics out there in general, which are sources of secondary microplastics. Of course, our mandate from the Commission to work on this was focused on the microplastics in products. So this is primarily where we focused our analysis. I think what's clear, because we had such a comprehensive starting point, certainly compared to other legislation, other analyses for microplastics, we looked broadly across many sectors, and we identified many uses of microplastics. And the tonnages involved, I think, were surprising and I think are not insignificant. If you look at the volume of releases that we have per year, it's around 43,000 tons per year. So this 500,000 tons over 20 years. And of course, it won't be as large as all of these sources of secondary microplastics. I think we need to be aware of this, but it is similar to some of these other sources of microplastics that have been modelled in the past, particularly releases from fibres from the washing of synthetic clothing is in an order predicted lower than the amount that we're predicting here. The losses of pre-production pellets, again, in the same order of magnitude as what we have estimated here from our work on these intentionally added microplastics. So they are significant. And I think it is very much useful to consider emissions for these microplastics as well as secondary microplastics. And of course, because of the cumulative nature of these microplastics, it's important that we minimize all sources to the environment to avoid this potential for risks in the future because of the accumulation over time.
Thank you, Pete. So we had Robert, were you raising your hand?
I did, and then you asked the question I was going to ask.
Okay.
but I might ask a follow-up question related to it then, if possible. Did anybody look into how the European Union's share of intentionally added microplastics, so rephrase, on a global scale, what percentage of the intentionally added microplastic pollution was the EU responsible for? Did anyone look at that?
It's a good question. It wasn't really within the bounds of our analyses, actually, to look at relatively. But I think you could compare, in broad terms, the sorts of uses that we have in the EU. And it's likely that those same uses would still happen in North America, South America, for example. I'd say China as well. So I don't think the European situation is unique in terms of these intentionally added microplastics. I would imagine that it's fairly typical. for a similar sort of economy to be using that level of microplastics per capita.
Okay, thank you, Pete. Clelia, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. Hi, everyone. This is Clelia Oziel from Chemical Watch. I have two questions to ask. One is I want to go back to that lower size limit. I know this is the sort of the topic that is discussed mostly. So we have on the one hand RAC saying there shouldn't be a lower limit. SEAC effectively is saying the same thing, although it's saying that we should perhaps consider that as a temporary measure, whereas ECHA is proposing that lower limit. So where do you think we go from here? I mean, mostly basically the committees are saying that there shouldn't be a lower limit. So what do you think the Commission could do on this, and what do you think the member states? How do you think the member states will react to it? And also, could the Commission perhaps, change ECHA's proposal and not introduce a lower limit? Would this be a possibility given the RAC and SEAC opinions? And I also wanted to ask about SEAC's temporary, the use of the word temporary. How temporary is it going to be? And how, these document checks that we talked about is going to be enforced in order to prevent the addition of smaller particles. So that's on the size issue. And then I also wanted to ask about the infill material for the sports pitches. So ECHA is saying that this is the biggest source of microplastic pollution, yet it isn't effectively banning it. I'm kind of, so if it is the biggest source, why aren't we banning it? RAC is saying there should be a ban. SEAC is not going one way or the other. What could the Commission do on this? Could there be a ban?
Thank you, Clelia. Should we go again with Pete, Tim, and Maria?
Sure. Okay. In terms of the first question about what will the Commission do with all of these various opinions that they have, I mean, this is not untypical at the end of a restriction procedure to have the dossier submitter with one version of a restriction, and then the RAC and the SEAC with various different recommendations on that restriction. So it typically always falls on the Commission to try and reconcile these various different views that they have alongside the views in the consultation, of course, and they are free to deviate from the dossier submitter and the RAC and SEAC opinions when they implement a restriction, as long as they can justify the changes that they make. So, of course, there could be a way of reconciling all of these different views. I think when we discussed this before, we talked about the emphasis on the supply chain and how this could perhaps be the way forward, and this idea for document checks is perhaps more prevalent at this stage of the process than it was when we initially started work. So I think that will be where the restriction could develop a bit more in terms of where these documents would need to be in place and how that could be enforced by the member states. In terms of temporary or not, well, maybe Maria can mention that, sorry, I won't go into that. Mm-hmm. But maybe answer this second question on the infill. If it's the biggest source, why not ban it? I think you need to recognise ECHA's role in this. Of course, we're not the decision maker, but our role is to give good technical information to the decision makers to make informed choices about policy options. And in this case, and I think you can see from the difference in costs from the different options that we've put forward, in the ban is it may be costing around 10 billion euros over 20 years, whereas the risk management measures is about a fifth of the price of that, about 2.5 billion euros. There's different effectiveness in terms of risk management measures, but very significant differences in the costs. So I think it's a real strength of our analyses that we've been able to look at the range of different options, so that decision makers ultimately can take an informed choice about the priority to remove the emissions and the resulting impacts on society of a ban necessarily, because they are large impacts that would be associated with that.
So maybe I can say something Oops, sorry, there's a little bit of echo. Something on the temporary, I think. SEAC does not provide a view as to how long this temporary lower size limit should be. The recommendation is related to the availability of analytical methods to be able to enforce the restriction. So it would be needed basically until there are adequate analytical methods. We don't know when that would be, and SEAC also provides recommendation that there should be they should be encouraged basically. But that is as far as the committee goes. And well, just I don't have much to add to what Pete said on the infill. It is just to mention that. In terms of weighing cost and benefits, that's what SEAC ideally does. But in this case, we are not able to quantify benefits in terms of the effects of the microplastics. Therefore, we are left with cost effectiveness mostly in this case. So all we can do is to try to set out as clearly as possible the potential impacts of the different options that we're looking at. And then it is for the decision makers to weigh those and make their decision about whether the higher reduction in emissions in one of the options is worth the additional cost, as Pete mentioned.
Okay, Tim, would you like to add that still from the RAC point of view?
No, I think I've answered everything I had to say already to Robert's questions. I don't really have anything to add here. Thank you.
Okay, it's our time is up. I would say that we are concluded, and I would like to thank the journalists attending. I would like to thank Peter, Pete, Tim, and Maria from our side, and we are happy to help you through our media service. So you can send us emails at press@echa.europa.eu, and we will also send you a short feedback survey from this event. Okay, enjoy your day and stay safe.